There is this Dutch company. It is around 400 years old, and at its peak, it was so outrageously valuable that if you took Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Saudi Aramco, combined all of their market value, you still would not reach the valuation this company once commanded. When people think about capitalism, wealth creation, old money, they reach for the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, names like that. And by doing so, they quietly accept a later chapter as the beginning. Almost no one looks back to a quiet Dutch entity that created the world's first corporation, the first stock exchange, the first IPO, and whose architecture never truly disappeared. That omission is not harmless nostalgia. It hides the moment when power changed form and never changed back. To see it, you have to move to 1580, when Spain takes over Portugal in a personal union, and two global empires merge under a single crown. Overnight, Spain inherits Portugal's overseas territories across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and the balance of power across the seas tilts so sharply that smaller states must choose between submission or innovation. The Dutch, technically still under Spanish rule, yet fighting for independence, do not have the luxury of denial. They face a consolidated enemy whose fleets stretch across oceans, and they cannot match that with guns alone. In that narrowing space, they make a decision that removes the old playbook. If they cannot defeat empire with land or titles, they will weaponize capital. Once that choice is made, waiting for a cleaner moment stops being an option, because any delay only leaves them facing the same empire with fewer routes and less room to improvise. That lost ability to stall forces the next move to be structural, not tactical. In 1602, 7 private trading companies merge into what becomes the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. And with that signature, a door closes on fragmented commerce. It is called the Dutch East India Company because it trades primarily with the East Indies, the region of present-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding islands. But that name conceals its function. On the surface, it is a merchant firm. Under the decks, it is a machine of economic warfare, armed ships, private armies, forts scattered across the globe. For the first time, ordinary Dutch citizens can fund imperial expansion and profit from it. And once that mechanism exists, no monarch can easily reclaim exclusive control. Wealth is no longer tied to land or titles. It is manufactured at scale through markets, and that shift cannot be undone by decree. From that moment, the old remedy of simply re-centralizing power becomes unusable, because the funding no longer lives in one court that can be seized. The Republic no longer has a path back to expansion that does not pass through the investors it has just created. With control no longer recoverable by a single political grab, the next constraint is survival inside a republic that is already changing its rules. Merchants draw the blueprints, but across the republic, the House of Orange watches, and their position is precarious enough that inaction would mean extinction. They are one of the most prominent dynasties of the time, yet they hold no kingdom, only a weak title and a fragile peace in a republic increasingly run by merchants. Amsterdam's elites push for stronger republican control. Spain wants the dynasty extinguished. Feudal land and inherited gold no longer secure influence. The House of Orange faces a choice that narrows quickly: fade into irrelevance or adapt to a system that does not honor crowns. They choose capital, and by tying their future to the VOC, they trade old legitimacy for new leverage. By choosing that tie, they lose the ability to stand apart as a neutral arbiter later, because their position now depends on the same machinery they would otherwise be expected to restrain. That dependency turns their next decisions into commitments that cannot be casually walked back. They do not run the VOC, but they bankroll it, and that commitment binds them to the company's fortunes in a way that cannot be casually reversed. In a merchant republic, where legacy alone guarantees nothing, their financial involvement becomes strategic leverage. Decades later, That connection turns official through two stadtholders, William IV and William V, descendants of the House of Orange, who serve as presidents of both the VOC and the West India Company. By assuming those positions, they move from fragile nobility to power backed by dividends. And once their authority is interwoven with corporate machinery, separating dynasty from enterprise would fracture both. After that, interweaving the option of restoring influence through purely dynastic authority disappears, because every attempt to reassert it would collide with the company's incentives and the investors whose fortunes now anchor the state. With that separation no longer available, the VOC's expansion stops being merely commerce and becomes governance by other means. As the VOC expands east, the family rises, without crowns, yet with influence that rivals monarchs. The company carries the Republic's flag, but it also carries the ambitions of a dynasty building empire in silence. The VOC does not behave like a business. It moves like a sovereign, because that is the design. When your market cap dwarfs the GDP of large countries and your private armies defeat military powers, you are no longer a merchant house competing for margins. You are an imperial state in your own right, and the distinction between company and crown dissolves in practice, even if it remains in theory. Once that distinction dissolves on the ground, the idea of correcting course with ordinary policy becomes unavailable, because the company's force and the state's legitimacy have already been fused in operation. That fusion has a price. Expansion becomes the only way to keep the structure coherent. At its peak, the Dutch East India Company is worth more than $7.9 trillion in today's money. What collapsed later was the corporation. What survived was the machinery. NVIDIA, currently the most valuable company in the world, stands at roughly half that valuation. And the comparison is not decorative. It signals that corporate scale can exceed the power of states. During the VOC's golden era from the early 1600s to the mid-1700s, over 1 million people depart the Netherlands bound for Asia. They board fleets of East Indiaman cargo ships that symbolize Dutch ambition, and they do so not as subjects of a king, but as employees of a corporation. Sailors, clerks, soldiers, craftsmen, all recruited to build trade empires across Ceylon, Java, Bengal, and beyond. Operate ports, guard warehouses, negotiate with rulers, enforce Dutch interests, sometimes at gunpoint. 1 million lives become components in a corporate engine, and once that engine proves profitable, scaling it back would mean surrendering dominance. After so many jobs, routes, and contracts become dependent on the outward push, the option of shrinking quietly becomes politically and financially impractical, because contraction would break promises already priced into fortunes at home. That dependence forces the system to formalize what it has already become. None of this scale happens in isolation. The VOC stands on 3 pillars: a powerful state charter, Amsterdam's financial elite, and the strategic backing of the House of Orange. The charter is not a typical trade license. It reads like a royal mandate. It grants full control over Dutch trade in Asia and authorizes the company to sign treaties, raise armies, capture territories, govern colonies. Each action carries the weight of a sovereign flag, even though the seal originates in a boardroom. And by granting those rights, the state relinquishes monopoly over force in exchange for expansion funded by private capital. Once that monopoly is relinquished, the state can no longer simply take back the tools of sovereignty without risking the very expansion it traded for, because the enforcement capacity is now lodged inside the company's structure. With force and legitimacy already delegated, the company is compelled to act like the state it has been licensed to imitate. With nearly 150 merchant ships, around 50,000 employees, and a private force of 10,000 soldiers, the VOC does not operate from the sidelines. It moves like a state with sails. From the Persian Gulf to Japan, it leaves its mark, and in the East Indies, its dominance becomes structural. In 1610, the VOC gains permission to build a post near the Ciliwung River. By 1619, it captures Jakarta and renames it Batavia, invoking the ancient name of the Netherlands. That renaming is not cosmetic. Batavia becomes a center of gravity in Asia, and for 300 years, Dutch governors rule from there, while surrounding kingdoms answer to its interests. Once such a hub exists, withdrawing would mean abandoning the infrastructure of control. And once governors rule from that hub, returning authority to scattered local arrangements stops being a live option, because the entire network now routes through one command point that cannot be dissolved without breaking the trade empire's coordination. That centralization makes the next constraint unavoidable. The engine needs capital that does not flinch. To sustain this expansion, the company cannot rely on kings or short-term loans. It must create a system that locks in capital. In August 1602, the VOC opens its doors to the public through the world's first initial public offering. For the first time in history, a company offers its future to ordinary people in exchange for funding. And when shares hit the market, capital floods in. Behind those sales stand the same elites who govern Dutch cities, keeping money flowing back into Amsterdam's markets and banks. By allowing broad participation, they distribute risk and consolidate power simultaneously, making the system harder to dismantle because too many fortunes now depend on its survival. Once fortunes are distributed across the public, the option of treating the company as a private experiment disappears, because any disruption now threatens households, elites, and the political stability that rests on their expectations. After that distribution, the Republic cannot unwind the VOC without first breaking the balance sheets that now hold it in place. That broad buy-in turns every political move into a constraint trade, not a clean reset. At home, political winds remain unstable. Amsterdam's merchant class pushes for tighter republican order. The House of Orange occupies a fragile role as stadtholders, with royal ambitions but no throne. Abroad, Habsburg Spain still considers Dutch independence a crime punishable by force. Feudalism offers no solution under such pressure. The House of Orange lacks serfs, silver mines, divine right. They commit instead to ruling through markets rather than crowns, building a power base rooted in financial institutions that make risk predictable. Once permanent shares are issued and ownership becomes transferable, the world's first secondary market emerges in Amsterdam, and speculation, arbitrage, hedging follow. Tools that define modern Wall Street appear not as abstractions, but as responses to constraint. Once ownership becomes transferable at scale, reversing into a world where power can be settled by lineage becomes impossible, because the ownership itself now moves faster than any title can. That mobility creates momentum that demands protection rather than restraint. Fear of missing out becomes fuel. From an index value of 100 in 1602, VOC shares rise to roughly 1,000 in the 1720s, a tenfold increase that signals not only profit but momentum. Building a global empire on public money carries risk, so the Dutch introduce limited liability. If a ship sinks or a trade route collapses, investors lose only what they put in. Their personal property remains protected. By separating personal assets from business liabilities, they remove a barrier to participation. And once that protection is codified, reversing it would collapse confidence. Share certificates are stamped, signed, exchanged freely. Ownership flows from hand to hand without royal permission or inheritance. And with each transfer, the old order recedes further. Once limited liability becomes the expectation, the system loses the option of enforcing accountability by threatening personal ruin. Because the promise of separation is now what keeps capital willing to stay in the machine. That promise, traveling with every certificate, makes the model exportable, and export makes retreat harder. Dutch financial influence does not remain confined within their borders. It crosses to Britain, carried by institutions and by one man in particular, William of Orange. Born into the House of Orange-Nassau and holding the Prince of Orange title, William absorbs the Dutch model where capital and governance intertwine. In 1688, as England faces political crisis and King James II loses the trust of Parliament, British leaders seek a Protestant claimant and turn to James's daughter, Mary, married to William. William sails to England with troops, and with a mindset shaped by the Dutch Republic and the Glorious Revolution follows. William and Mary II take the throne in a joint monarchy, but the shift is financial as much as political. Once that throne is taken, through a coalition that expects a financial order, the option of ruling England without markets shrinks immediately, because legitimacy now depends on the same credit mechanisms that made the transition possible. That constraint shows up as soon as governance needs funding that taxes alone cannot provide. During William's reign, England establishes the Bank of England, creates public credit, introduces government bonds, and funds wars through capital markets. Dutch innovations become embedded in British law, and once public credit underwrites state power, retreating to purely feudal finance is no longer viable. Even before William's arrival, Dutch ships have crossed the Atlantic. In 1609, the Halfman sails under the VOC to what is now New York Harbor. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company founds New Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan. Its organized streets, trade networks, diverse communities reflect commercial logic rather than aristocratic planning. And that logic roots itself in contracts, credit, global linkage. Once public credit becomes embedded in law, the option of financing power without borrowing is no longer practical, because war and state survival are now priced through markets that must be serviced, not merely commanded. That servicing mentality follows the settlements that inherit Dutch structure even under new flags. In 1664, the British take over and rename it New York, but they retain much of the Dutch legal and financial structure because it works. Systems blend, habits endure, and over time, Amsterdam and London develop complementary financial personalities. Amsterdam favoring banks and public credit, London leaning into speculation and fast markets. By the 1700s, their elites cooperate, bank-oriented finance meeting market-oriented innovation. These ideas travel west through colonial ties, and New York inherits legal structures, credit, customs, institutional habits from both cities. Decades of shared history transform a port town into a financial engine. And once those foundations solidify, the Atlantic becomes a corridor for capital rather than merely ships. Once those habits endure under British takeover, the option of wiping the slate clean disappears, because the inherited commercial machinery becomes the city's operating system rather than a removable layer. That operating system spreads influence, but it also spreads fragility when the machine grows too large to steer cleanly. The impact of Dutch finance echoes from VOC charter ports to New York streets, from the London Stock Exchange to parliamentary halls. The VOC transforms trade, corporate finance, state power. But scale introduces strain. By the late 1700s, cracks appear. Power has scaled quickly, oversight has not. Corruption creeps in. Internal divisions deepen. Military costs rise. Competition from Britain and France intensifies. At first, the company survives, but behind the scenes, decision-making slows and officials prioritize personal gain. Global markets shift, becoming less tolerant of monopolies and more open to flexible rivals, and the grip loosens. Once the grip loosens under those costs, the VOC can no longer cut back without also weakening the force that still holds its roots together. That narrowing forces the ultimate intervention, and that intervention removes the company as a sovereign actor, even as its blueprint survives. By 1795, the VOC is no longer all-powerful. The Dutch state steps in, nationalizes the company, and in 1796, the once mighty charter expires. A two-century experiment winds down, and that expiration removes the corporate sovereign from the seas, but it does not erase its architecture. Instead, its ideas transform into modern finance, legal structures, multinational models that persist. The empire collapses, the blueprint remains, and that blueprint is still operating. Once the state nationalizes the company, the option of returning to the old, chartered, private sovereign model in the same form is gone, because the precedent is set that the state can absorb the structure, even if it cannot erase what the structure taught the world. That survival of architecture shifts the battleground from oceans to balance sheets. In modern-day Netherlands, the legacy is visible. The country is no longer a seafaring empire, but a financial one. It ranks among the most competitive industrial economies, attracts over $4.3 trillion in foreign direct investment inward, sends out $5.2 trillion outward, holds more than $3.5 trillion abroad. For a nation smaller than California in population, the footprint is disproportionate. And behind that network of capital, one family still casts a shadow: the House of Orange-Nassau. The crown is ceremonial, but connections are not. From defense to energy to corporate governance, the royal family remains tied to industry, holding stakes in companies like Shell, maintaining wealth through trusts and investment vehicles. Once influence consolidates through holdings and vehicles rather than conquest, the option of measuring power by territory alone disappears, because leverage now travels through corporate structures that can outlast any flag. That continuity shows up again when a new titan forms under a familiar logic of capital and title. In 1907, Royal Dutch merges with Shell Transport and Trading Company to form Royal Dutch Shell, a name that dominates the global energy sector for over a century. Again, a Dutch company carries capital and a royal title, blending enterprise and dynasty. ING Group rises as one of Europe's powerful financial institutions, tracing roots back to Dutch strength and corporate architecture that echoes VOC foundations. Across oil, banking, logistics, the descendants of merchants and businessmen linked to the VOC hold stakes, sit on boards, shape policy through foundations and capital networks. Their surnames may not dominate headlines, but the structures they built persist. Once these structures persist through mergers and institutions, the option of treating them as temporary arrangements vanishes, because each generation inherits a framework already reinforced by law, capital, and dependency. That is why later empires look less like inventions and more like iterations inside a template that was already operating. When we think of capitalism, we often think of Rothschilds, Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan. Yet those figures did not invent the model. They operated within it. Long before them, the House of Orange helped build a system where war, trade, finance moved together, where capital could outmatch crowns. That system engineered a corporate-state hybrid, scaled across centuries and continents, and it defines how the world governs money today. The Netherlands may not rule the seas, but Dutch capital moves across borders with influence fleets once held. And that continuity forces a question that does not belong to history alone. Once the model becomes the governing baseline, the option of stepping outside it without paying a higher cost collapses, because every major institution is now arranged around incentives, the blueprint already set. That same arrangement also hardwired enforcement into profit, and the cost was carried by those trapped inside the company's expansion. Before closing, the ledger must show the cost. The VOC committed atrocities during its expansion in Asia. On the Banda Islands, it nearly exterminated the indigenous population. Thousands were killed. Survivors enslaved locals, replaced with Dutch settlers. In the Ambuina massacre, it executed English and Japanese traders accused of plotting to seize a Dutch fort. In the Batavia massacre, thousands of Chinese civilians were killed in what is now Jakarta. Forced labor systems compelled indigenous populations to cultivate spice crops for company benefit, bringing suffering and deprivation. Violence suppressed resistance, dismantled local political structures, maintained control over trade routes and resources. These actions were not side notes. They were mechanisms of enforcement embedded in the corporate model. Once enforcement is embedded as a mechanism rather than an exception, the option of expanding without coercion disappears inside the same structure. Because control of routes and resources is now treated as a condition of maintaining the system's promises. From the rise of the VOC to the reign of Royal Dutch Shell, a pattern emerges. Power and capital remain inseparable. The House of Orange recognized early that capital could be more potent than crowns, and by transforming trade into a corporate-state hybrid, they left a legacy that shapes modern finance. Markets now hold power once reserved for monarchs. And if that is true, the final question is not decorative. If the crown has become invisible, who governs the markets that wear it?